Hello friends old and new, wherever you may be in the world, welcome back to the channel. My name is Stian, and today we have this beautiful 1966 Omega Genéve on the bench. You see it has this gorgeous glossy black dial with the golden details, but it's not quite as it should be. Now let's first check that the watch works as it should. See the hands set. I want to try to turn the hands back. There's something strange with the hand setting. So that's a little bit odd. We'll have to see what's wrong there. But it feels like the crown doesn't really set in the right position when I try to pull it out. So that might be an indication. Otherwise, we see the watch is in a very nice visual condition. The case is very nice. It has a signed crown. So yeah, it's a nice watch to wear for sure. But there is a but, or maybe a couple of buts. So if buts aren't really your thing, then be forewarned. The first thing we want to do when we check a watch is to put it on a device called a time grapher, which we see here. The time grapher gives us a sort of a snapshot of the health of the watch. Basically, we want to see parallel lines in that window. I'll talk a little bit more about those other values later. For now, let's open the watch and see what we can find inside. And we see it's an Omega 562 movement. It's a member of Omega's 550 family, which really dominated their watches in the 60s. Very highly mass-produced movement family, also very good quality. We take the rotor off first because we don't want to put the movement down on the rotor and put more strain on the post. And this movement comes out through the crystal, so we also have to take the bezel off with the crystal. And there we can see this beautiful dial a little bit better. We're going to take off the hands as well. Use these levers for that, so we can do that without damaging the dial. And a watch movement basically has two sides, and right now we're working on the dial side. So this is where the dial obviously was, and here we have the calendar disc and everything needed to turn that disc every 24 hours. So we're going to take that off, and then we're going to turn it over to the other side. And the other side is this one, train side. We call it the train side because there's a train of wheels and pinions that rotate at various speeds and then eventually turn the hands around in a timely fashion. We just took off the automatic module. And now we're letting down the mainspring to make sure there's no power in the train as we start disassembling it. So this is not a very complicated watch. Of course, all watches show time. That's kind of the purpose. At least it used to be, and it can be discussed nowadays. But anyway. And in addition to showing the time, this one also shows the date. And it has a self-winding or an automatic function, so two complications. So all in all, I believe it's a little bit less than 100 parts. We'll see that spread out in a little while. So all the different wheels are basically held between this main plate and one or two bridges. And the bridges are then screwed onto the main plate. If you're interested in understanding how the different parts work together to achieve that end result of showing accurate time, I made a video that outlines that quite nicely, I hope. So we're down to the last bridge, and that's the bridge for the barrel. The barrel is where the mainspring is, and that's the power source for a watch. We're going to open the barrel. We're going to have a look at the spring inside to see if it's still possible to reuse. We saw on the time grapher it didn't run that great, so it might be that we need to put in a new mainspring. But let's have a look at the old one first. Before we get there, let's take off the keyless works. That's these parts here that allow us to wind the watch and also to set the time. Quite intricate invention. Has been in use for a couple 150 years now, so pretty clever back in the day. Now we're going to revisit this part here. It's the cover plate for the calendar. We just took it off, but on this plate you actually have the date jumper. That's a spring-driven little L-shaped lever here. And what it does is to make the date jump. Well, duh, hence the name. Here's the automatic module. Also going to take that apart. Quite a few small wheels and pinions inside there as well. And one thing when I say wheels and pinions, so a pinion is basically kind of a wheel, just with very few teeth. In watches, pinions typically have less than 14 teeth, but no less than 6. They're also made of steel, most commonly, whereas the wheels in watches are made of brass, typically. But other materials can be used as well, of course. Some wheels can also be made of steel, especially the escape wheel. I promised we'll open the barrel, and let's see now. Old gunk. I was about to say my favorite, but it certainly isn't. Let's uncoil the mainspring from the barrel and look at the damage. Well, not damage actually, but the gunk. And there's plenty to go around. So we're going to clean the barrel and the lid a little bit. Last thing we're going to do is take out the shock settings. These are jewels held in place by a tiny lyre-shaped spring. And as the name implies, they protect the watch from all the bumps watch gets when it's in use. Okay, so we took the watch apart. Quite a few parts that we're now going to put in baskets and in the cleaning machine. So nice to have a machine do work for us. Let's turn our attention to the case. This is the bezel with the crystal held in it. And there's something very odd here. Because this bezel has what we call a rehaut built into it. The rehaut is that shiny slope you see around the dial on most watches. But this one has an extra one, that golden ring you see there. You might have seen it initially as well, and it shouldn't be there. It's very odd. And it was also seen to be super glued into the bezel, which is also odd. This bezel should take a standard crystal and not one with this kind of ring inside it. Anyway, let's clean all the case parts in the ultrasonic. So we got the movement back from the cleaning machine. We're going to put a few of the parts into this liquid called Fixo-Drop. What this does is to help lubrication stay in place. And there are a few parts where this is important. Now you may think that a watchmaker needs all kinds of liquids and special things just to service a relatively simple watch. And not really. You need a good set of screwdrivers, some tweezers, and the most basic oils. But you don't really need Fixo-Drop, for instance. So we're going to put the mainspring back in the barrel. The mainspring was undamaged. Given that this is an automatic watch, we need to make sure that the mainspring is allowed to slip a little bit inside the barrel. That's the mechanism that ensures that the watch does not overwind, or that you can overwind it by turning a crown too many times, for instance. But we also don't want the mainspring to slip too much, because that would take too much power away from the watch. So to get the right mix, we put some grease on the sides of the barrel. And then we use this mainspring winder to be able to coil the mainspring up inside it. And then we can press that into the barrel. And there we go. And yes, I said it before, watchmakers are tool junkies, but some tools are quite indispensable. Mainspring winder is one of them. And with the mainspring in the barrel, we can put in the barrel arbor, put the lid back on, and then we're going to press fit it. Voila!
So shaking.
You go, girl. Or not a girl. Well, go anyway, I'd say. We took out the jewels for the shock settings. And we're going to put a tiny little drop of light oil. This is where the pivots for the balance rest. So we'll make sure the friction is minimal. Yeah, what did I say there? Did I say minimum or minimal? Should be minimal. Anyway, there's one shock setting on each side of the main plate. Put the one on the dial side first. This movement is a little bit strange there, in that it has a screwed in setting. And on the train side, we put it in the balance, and then we can see if the balance rotates freely. And that looks just fine. Alright, for the base movement, there was a little bit too much play for the barrel arbor and the barrel bridge, so we're going to close the hole a little bit. And this is where all the testosterone that builds up in watchmakers really comes in handy. It's a pretty well-known fact that watchmakers generate more testosterone than 72 Spanish bulls during mating season in Pamplona. I know at least personally, I once jumped out of a plane while I was juggling running chainsaws that were on fire. And honestly, it was kind of boring compared to my day job. That's why they kind of refer to watchmakers as living life in a fast lane. Anyway, we made the hole smaller. So small that we need to open it up a little bit again, and that's on purpose. We're using this smoothing broach that makes the hole a little tiny bit bigger, just big enough. And at the same time, it also packs the metal a little bit tighter around the hole, so you get a stronger bearing. Alright, with that done, we're going to put a little bit of oil around the barrel arbor on each side. And then we can start rebuilding the movement. The way I like to do this is to build the base movement first, and then you test it to make sure that it runs well. And if it does, then you can build the complications on top of it. Of course, you always check the watch after building the complications as well, that everything still runs well. But as a general rule, it will not change much if everything is fine. Of course, if it's not fine, then we'll have to work on that. For those of you who haven't seen too many vintage watches, the color of the movement is actually a very typical Omega thing from back then. The movement, the plates, the bridges and so forth is made of brass, but it's copper plated. And it's a very distinct color. It's basically only Omega that used this color. Nowadays, they mostly use rhodium plating. That's kind of silvery. But they also have some movements that are gold plated, for instance. So we just put in the train of wheels, so we see that it runs freely. We put in the ratchet wheel that's on top of the barrel, and that's the one that makes the barrel arbor rotate inside the barrel and coil the mainspring around it when you wind the watch. But to do that, we also need what we're assembling here, which is the crown wheel, and that's the wheel you turn when you turn the crown. So someone thought of some pretty explanatory names, I suppose. So with that, we can turn the movement over again. We're going to grease this extended arbor from the center wheel from the other side. And we're going to put the cannon pinion on top of it, and that helps us transfer power from the train side to the dial side. Because there's not really much point in having all those wheels and pinions spin on the other side if that couldn't actually drive the wheels that rotate the hands. So that's the purpose of that. And we can reassemble the rest of the keyless works. It's called the keyless works because in the old days they actually had keys that you needed to carry around with the watch. So you put the key into a little slot in the back of the watch, and then you could wind the mainspring by hand. And in even older watches, you even had to do that for setting the time. And that's a long time ago. Back when women were women and men were animals. That actually doesn't sound like that long ago. Anyway, one of the key things we need to do in a watch is to minimize friction, because there isn't really that much power, it's just that mainspring inside the barrel. So wherever anything can create friction, we want to minimize it by lubricating. But we don't want to lubricate too much, because that would actually create more friction, more drag. Now, if you remember all the way back to the beginning of the video, there was a problem setting the time properly. And that is down to this part we're screwing down here, the setting lever spring. What this part does is to control the positions of the crown. So when you pull it out, when you press it in, and so forth. And this watch has two positions. One for winding the watch and one for setting the time. There's no quick set for the date. So why are there 3 notches for the setting lever? Elementary, my dear Watson. It's the wrong setting lever. So probably someone working on this watch broke the setting lever and just put in a spare one without considering it being the right one. The right one has 2 notches. There's 2 crown positions. This is the Omega 562, as I mentioned initially. The Omega 563 and later versions had 3 crown positions. The third one was the quick set for the date. But as you can imagine, those 3 notches don't line up to the 2 notches. So that's why we had problems setting the time initially. So it seems to work fine now. Let's then put in the seconds pinion. The seconds pinion has this little tension spring on top of it. And the reason is that that seconds pinion is the last wheel, if you will, or the last pinion in the train. So it would stutter if there wasn't anything to hold it a little bit tight. So with all the other things in place, we can put in the pallet fork. The pallet fork is what lets the power from the mainspring be released. As it flicks from left to right, it ticks and it talks, and it ticks and it talks. And with every tick and talk, it lets the escape wheel and the whole train go a little bit forward. We're also going to lubricate the pallet stones. That's a little bit difficult to see, so let's zoom in. Ah, much better. We put a tiny little drop on the exit pallet stone, and then we flip the pallet fork from side to side. And that lets the escape wheel on the left here go a little bit forward. And every time it does, one of the teeth scrapes over the pallet stone surface. And that's the friction we want to minimize. With the escapement lubricated, we can put the balance in, and hopefully the watch should start running. Fingers crossed. Yeah, that is nice to see. Let's then oil the various jewel holes a little bit. So this is where the wheels, the ends of the wheels basically stick through. So we also want to make sure there's minimal friction there. And then we're going to demagnetize the watch before we test it again. So let's see what the time grapher says now. See, the lines are nice and parallel still. Currently running 11 seconds fast per day, which is slightly too fast. The amplitude is fine. The beat error is slightly high. The beat error is basically whether the ticks and the talks are in sync. With a high beat error, we say tick-tock, 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 instead of tick-tock, tick-tock. So that's what we're trying to fix here. And then we adjust the rate a little bit afterwards. And that looks just fine. And with the base movement running nicely, we can start rebuilding the automatic module. The reverser wheel is that little wheel here, and that's the one that allows the watch to wind itself, whether the rotor goes in the clockwise or in the anti-clockwise direction. We're going to treat that with something called Lubetta 105. We basically soak it, and then we dry it off a little bit and let it rest for about 15 minutes. So there's a little bit of black magic going on here. So the reverse wheel actually has 2 wheels, one on top of each other. And one of those wheels mesh with one of those little pinions and the other with the other. And combined, that makes this driving wheel, the wheel we see on top here, always go in one direction. We're going to test that in a second. Let's see then. The pinion I'm rotating here is the one that meshes with the rotor. And you can see that whether we push it clockwise or counterclockwise, the driving wheel still goes in only one direction. So that looks good. Give it a little bit of lubrication before we put it into the movement. And then we test that the watch still can be wound. Common problem with these movements, this family of movements, is that the reverse wheel is a little bit worn. Becomes harder and heavier to wind the watch because you drag the whole automatic works with you when you wind it with the crown. And that's one of the weaknesses of the movement. So with that in place, we started working on the calendar works. There's a set of wheels that go from the center that then makes the date disc rotate. And then we can put this cover plate on top with a jumper in it. I'm going to screw it down just a tiny little bit, just to keep it in place, and then we can put the jumper in the right position. We also need to make sure that the date disc isn't clamped down improperly by that cover. Now this watch has a semi-quick set for the date. The way that works is that the wheel that flips the date over has this little nubbin. And if we turn the hands backwards, we see it just slips past the previous date, and then we can turn the date one day forward again. After oiling the jumper a little bit, we're going to flick it through all the dates, and then we can put the dial back on. Now, in the beginning of the video, almost half an hour ago, I alluded to there being something a little bit off with the watch. And yes, we did find something in the movement, but the dial has been refinished. So what that means is that someone then took what was probably a very damaged dial, stripped it all the way down to the base metal, and then painted it, put back the indices and so forth, so that it looks as it does now. And this is a point of contention among collectors. Most would say that unless a dial is pretty badly damaged, you would never refinish it. Of course, we do not know what the dial looked like before it was refinished, or repainted, if you will. But what we do know is that it's not quite as it should be. If we look at this other dial, which is completely original, there are a couple of differences that stand out. One is that the font used on the Genéve is actually not correct. Looks nice, but it's not how it should be. And the second is that the automatic is a little bit too narrow. And lastly, these glossy dials were actually gilt back then, which means that there's a layer of basically gold paint underneath the black, whereas this one has been painted with gold paint on top of the black. To a lot of people, these things do not really matter. They just like the look of a watch, and that's fine. But most collectors would then not really be happy with this. Before we go any further, let's just check that the hour hand and the minute hand are put so that the date changes quite close to midnight. Yeah, that looks just fine. Then for the seconds hand, there's also a snag. So it seems, and I saw this on the Seconds Pinion when I took it out before cleaning it, that it seemed to be very black at the end. And it seems the same person who put in the wrong setting lever also then did something weird with the seconds hand. Seems to have been glued to the seconds pinion rather than press fit as it should be. And we see it doesn't really fit nicely on the pinion. So it turns out the hole is actually too small for the pinion to go properly in. So we're going to have to open the hole a little bit. And yes, we have a tool for that. This little tool here allows us to hold the hand like this safely, and then we can use these tiny little brooches to open the hole. The smallest broach is 0.05 millimeters, and we're going to use the second smallest at 0.1 millimeter. Put that into the hole for the pinion, and then we can open it a little bit. To put the seconds hand on, I'm also using a different movement holder that has support on the underside for the pinion there. Unfortunately, I didn't video pressing the seconds hand on, but trust me, it will be there in a few frames. Before we get there, we're going to put in a new crystal. So we use this crystal lift. These acrylic crystals are just flexible enough that you can press them a little bit in and then let them expand into the bezel. Rotating the crystal just to make sure it's in on all sides, and then we can release the pressure. Oh, there's the seconds hand. Told you. But hey, where did the automatic module go? Well, I actually took it off in order to be able to support the seconds pinion. Normally you wouldn't need to, because the module itself will provide enough support. But if the pinion is tight or the hole in the seconds hand is not big enough, then that's a good idea to do. You can always put it back in. So let me know in the comments. Let's start a flame war there over whether or not you appreciate refinished dials like this. If you think this is still a watch you would like to wear, or if you think that no, given that the dial is refinished and not exactly as it should be, then it's not for me. I'm actually very interested in knowing what people think about that. And hey, there's 20,000 subscribers now. That is amazing. 20,000 people finding it worthwhile listening to some idiot talking about watchmakers and testosterone. But seriously, I'm very humbled that the channel is growing like this. It's really, really nice. My sincere thanks to everyone who actually spends some of their valuable time watching my videos and listening to my idiot rants. Alright, we almost finished the watch. Just going to put the case back on and then put a nice strap on. And that's how the watch looks. What do you think? Is it a watch you would like wearing? Let's see how it looks on my wrist. It's a good looking watch. I wish the dial was original, but it is what it is. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then clicking like and subscribe will really help the channel. We'll be back shortly with another video. Until then, ta-ta.